Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in this wide world. I'm Robert, and today with me I've got my colleague Joelle. I'm a senior solutions consultant here at dRofus. Joelle is our senior customer success manager. So basically, our job is to try to keep our customers happy and satisfied and engaged with our software at the end of the day. But let's get right into the topic today and why we're all here. So. First up, from a dRofus perspective, we decided to go with hopefully maybe a sort of provocative question and title, which is, we've been doing openBIM for 20 years or more, and where's the actual revolution? Have we actually, and are we actually delivering value in aggregate, particularly for our owners and operators of these buildings? We might be delivering incremental cost savings through design construction, but ultimately, are our processes really delivering long-term value when you start to look at the operational costs of these facilities that we're helping to design and build at the end of the day? So the first thing we wanted to sort of reset a little bit and just start with a really simple example, right? So what's an example of a true digital revolution that is very largely based on data? And imagining that most people here remember going to a Blockbuster, maybe not, but they're very hard to find these days. And Netflix and other streamers have significantly overtaken them, right? And Netflix was the leader. How or what drove Netflix success, right? Ultimately, their goal is to make money. So how do they go about making money? They want to make their platform and their services easy to use, which means they need to also make it easy for people to find what it is they're looking for and what they want, and maybe even also predict what you are likely to be interested in so that your eyeballs stay glued to that screen, which means you keep paying them, which means they can keep paying the studios and the producers of the content in the first place. So how ultimately are they doing this, right? Structured data is the core to their success. They're keeping their customer data super well organized, right? They know everything about your viewing habits. They know how much time you spent looking and watching each minute of film or TV at the end of the day. And they demand a similar level of data structure and organization from their partners, right? So they're providing methods to organize and aggregate that information so that they can ultimately deliver what people are interested in. That's what's driving how they make money, right? So structured data is core to their success, and exchanging that data between different parties is ultimately core to their success. So bring that back to the context of AECO, how do we tend to talk about data exchange within our industry? So first off, let's take a step back and say, okay, industry foundation classes IFC. I'm going to guess that there's some people here who know that first version was released in 1996. It was actually driven by Autodesk. A bunch of other organizations, including Graphisoft, hopped in very quickly. And then ultimately, management of it was handed over to Building Smart, the fine folks that are hosting the webinar today. And I think, as everybody knows, IFC defines geometry, data, and relationships, right? So that's IFC is one way that we frequently talk about data exchange. The other way that we frequently talk about data exchange in the industry is COBie, right? And that's a little bit newer. It was released in 2007. It was started by owner. Now it's managed by the National Institute of Building Sciences. And ultimately, it's really focused on data and relationships and doesn't worry about geometry, practically speaking. The reality is both of these things are data schemas, but we talk about them in the context of file formats almost exclusively within our industry. So that means we're talking about here's a file with data in it, as opposed to talking about what data do you need or what data can I exchange with you. And the reality is, as data schemas, software could be natively written on top of both of these things if you wanted to, which would really remove the notion of file format at the end of the day. But that is a whole separate conversation that we're not going to get into today. So just looking at the history of IFC in order to sort of set the stage here, again, 1996 version 1 was released. Archicad was the first with adopting in 1998. Archicad was 11 years old at the time. Tekla, Revit, AutoCAD architecture, etc. The point being, it's existed for 30 years and it's taken almost 20 years for the major software players in terms of BIM and modeling and design development to adopt IFC and sort of speak it at a relatively basic level, again, in terms of give me an IFC file or here's my IFC file, right? And again, we've distilled it down to just sort of sending those files back and forth. So what was the promise we made? And I will put myself in that bucket of people making promises or things that we were at least telling ourselves and whoever would listen to us at the end of the day. And so we said, we can change the world and BIM would deliver value, but ultimately who has BIM delivered value for? And in the greater context, are we actually delivering value again for owners and operators? So, I was a Revit guy. Most people on this call may or may not be aware of that, but we started really within the realm of design and construction, right? And we said, okay, this is great in this space. And we talked about delivering value, but the value was really focused on that very small bubble. Frankly, we were not thinking very much about design requirements and design standards and how that feeds into what you're actually designing. I think it's fair to say, in aggregate, we probably weren't thinking very much about facility information and stakeholder needs that are driving those design requirements, which is ultimately driving the design. And ultimately, that you really probably want feedback loops between all of these things. I would argue in aggregate, this is not functioning, right? Can we all lay hands on specific case studies where we can paint a wonderful picture of how we went from left to right and it was great and we all sang kumbaya? Absolutely. But if we look across the industry, this is not happening in aggregate on an everyday basis. The same, I would argue, is true for truly realizing savings, particularly for the owners and operators. There have been studies done over the years. This one was particularly focused on Kobe, where they highlighted potentially 96% savings. Again, show me in aggregate that projects are even seeing 25%. And I would challenge everybody to about that question, right? Because I would argue that's not the case. Can we all find examples? Yes. But the reality is that, we haven't really changed the direction of the supercarrier or insert whatever metaphor you like. Actually, planes are worse to turn than ships. But regardless, the point is, have we actually changed anything? And again, I would argue no, particularly when we're in the context of delivering value to the owners and operators. Traditionally, we handed over reams of paper to the owners and operators, right? We said, here you go, have fun, good luck. And now we're sort of backing up the digital dump truck and just dumping zeros and ones into their laps in whatever shared environment you want to choose, where you're going to say, here's all your PDFs, here's your Revit files, here's your IFCs, here's your whatever Excel files. Good luck, right? If anything, we've made it worse, right? And sort of again, why, right? We look at Kobe as a collection exercise, right? We don't view Kobe as a collaborative way to figure out, well, what is it you actually need? It's like, oh yeah, fill out this Kobe spreadsheet. Okay, hand it over to the next person, fill out the Kobe spreadsheet. We're not actually having a conversation about what do we need to get to, and ultimately what format does that need to be in? Because again, Kobe, data schema, but we distill it down to here's an Excel spreadsheet. Same thing with IFCs, right? We really view IFCs by and large as file exchange. And again, I would argue that's really one step removed from here's the paper step, paper set. Go ahead and use that as your reference as you do your part of the project, right? Have we really improved things significantly other than saying, here you go, here's an IFC rather than my RVT? And that sort of feeds into, frankly, how BIM execution plans are treated at the end of the day. We define BIM objectives, right? What are we actually doing? We're limiting our risk at the end of the day. We're saying, well, no, you can't do this or you can do that with the data that I'm going to give you. So again, standards and protocols, those are often serving the immediate needs of, frankly, the design team, right? What are, again, mixing in that sort of what's my risk and how am I going to manage or mitigate my risk which also falls down to level of detail and deliverables, right? Oh, yeah, here's geometry, but you can only rely upon this geometry for that, right? So again, we're not really talking about how can we collaboratively deliver something. We're saying, well, my piece of the pie is this, and this is what you can rely on in a very narrow way. And ultimately, this is all waterfall planning. So we also define quality control and validation processes, but these things are all being defined up front before anybody goes and does these things. And then once you get into the thick of it, how often are these things adhered to? And again, can we all point to case studies where it works? Sure. But are we doing that in aggregate across the board? And ultimately, is it delivering value for our customers at the end of the day? And then ultimately, information delivery plans, again, oftentimes owners, operators are going to say, well, do whatever you think is best, or, well, just give me everything, as opposed to here's what I actually need. And, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir in terms of this virtual room, but ultimately, what is one of the big issues here? Team member alignment, right? What is the core motivation of the majority of the stakeholders for any design project? Getting the design done, getting your permits, getting your certificate occupancy, managing cost, right? Those are the core goals today of the majority of our teams that are delivering buildings for owners and operators. And where in that list is there any motivation to actually collaborate about mapping and tracking data that's going to deliver value to the owner when the project's done? Right. And it's not there, in my opinion. And so just as a small vignette of a real experience with this, in my previous life, I worked for a design firm and we designed a building. I wasn't part of that team. I was not part of that project, but we designed a building. In particular, our engineers designed the mechanical and electrical portions of that building. That building got built. A contractor came in, GC'd it. There was a control system implementation where they said, okay, now we're going to take the design documents, we're going to figure out how to actually implement the control system for the mechanical and electrical systems. Great. And then that building was handed over. That building was handed over with an intelligent control system that the building owner can use to monitor what's going on in that building and see how the HVAC is performing, see how the light systems are performing. Where I entered the picture was I was asked afterwards to attempt to implement a digital twin for this particular building and gain access to those systems to use as data to feed into the digital twin. Well, the problem was that that control system spoke an entirely different language in terms of how it identified all the parts of the building, as opposed to how the designers had identified all the parts of the building in their design models. So while I had models that represented what the building was, and I had data that represented how the building was performing, I had no way to map those different information sets together effectively in order to actually produce the digital twin at the end of the day, because nobody kept the keys to the kingdom. That systems control engineer who actually implemented the systems based on the design, they were looking at the design documents, they were looking at the information from the contractors and saying, okay, the designer called it AHU1, we're going to call it AHU 1.05A, whatever. And they didn't keep that map, right? And that was a simple piece of data that if it had been retained, we could have done so much more with later, as opposed to me spending hours manually deciphering what was what by going through multiple Excel spreadsheets. So again, this is an example of where just a small bit of data, had it been captured, had it been retained, would have made all the difference in being able to do something later on that potentially would provide value in terms of delivering a digital twin in this case. Are there lots of other examples? Absolutely. And that's where we're going to bring in Joelle to start to talk a little bit more about, well, how do we actually solve these problems and where do we get started?
Great. So Robert did an excellent job of highlighting some of the difficulties we face. Now let's spend some time discussing how we can overcome some of these obstacles. So I think of this as a really big puzzle. we're focusing on data collection, and we need to identify what pieces we need to complete that puzzle. So of course, there are going to be several pieces, but I want to focus on three specifically: goals, people, and the actual data. So as Robert mentioned, we don't want to just see this as a data collection exercise. Why are we doing this? This is something that our owners really need to think about. Our approach is critical to understanding what is required to achieve our desired outcomes. So some popular reasons include consistency, ensuring that the right people have access to the right information during design, constructions, and operations, as well as consistency across your portfolio. If you're an owner that owns hotels, you may want all of your lobbies to have a similar look and feel. Another reason may be efficiency, capturing the right data points to determine how the building is performing. Robert alluded to that earlier. Being consistent and efficient may also allow you to reduce your operating cost. And when we think about operations as an organization, you really need to understand what drives how you operate. So again, we're putting a lot of impetus on our owners to provide us some good information at the beginning. In a past life, working with one organization, they were quick to admit that the only constant they had was change. So when they were starting off projects, they were asking for 100 data points. They quickly realized that because so many of those data points were changing so frequently, it actually didn't make sense. So they reduced that to the 30 data points that were really critical to them. For another organization, everything revolved around safety. So anything to do with safety, whether that was collecting information about potentially hazardous materials that were used or how they were stored, or operating procedures for using pieces of equipment, that was truly their focus. And so that's where they centered and developed their outcomes on. So again, we really have to have our owners explain to us why we are doing this, what they're expecting, so that it just isn't seen as a data collection exercise, but people can understand the value. So let's take a moment to review some of the people involved in a project and understand their motivations. It's natural for people to be focused on what they need to complete their specific task, forgetting the bigger picture. So if we look at the design and construction process, the design and construction managers want to get things done on time and on budget. So one of their biggest concerns is the program. What's supposed to be in the building and how big should it be? So a couple of data points that might be very important to them are room name and room number. We'll talk about room number a little bit more in a bit, as well as areas. So again, how large that project is. We know that design and construction is only a fraction of the cost of building over its life cycle. How often do we speak to the person that's going to be responsible for maintaining the building? Their input is key to understanding how to keep that building running efficiently. So again, from their perspective, equipment IDs, and I said IDs because a particular piece of equipment may have several. We'll discuss this more in depth later. Also, things like installation dates are critical for warranties. So again, making sure that the right people are at the table to understand why we're doing things and what information we need to collect and where we can get it. And if you think, when we talk about operations, most of the time we think about the major systems such as HVAC and electrical, but there's much simpler stuff to maintain and information required to do that. So, again, you just opened a brand new office building that has a lovely custom Calcutta reception desk in a 3-story lobby. How are you going to keep it clean? So as I mentioned here, having the specifications, particularly the Part 3 execution. And again, if you have a facility that has hazardous materials, making sure that you have those safety data sheets handy is great. Now, it would be awesome if everybody knew exactly where that was. But what's perhaps more important is understanding what I need to be able to easily find this data. So in this case, the specification number, as well as the product name. So we've touched briefly on the why. We've talked about who needs to be involved. Let's focus on the data a little bit more. So this is a true story from my days working with an architecture firm. Started off a project. One of the first things we do is assign room numbers. The design team was using these room numbers for about 18 months over the course of the design process. Of course, for those of you that are engineers, quite frequently, there is an association between maybe how you number your electrical panel boards with room numbers, etc. We all are used to using these numbers and everything happens. So we get to about 95% construction documents right before we're about to go out to bid. The owner's rep that's responsible for this comes along and gives us a new set of numbers to be able to, next slide, to be able to use in the drawings. So of course, calamity ensues now, because if we start to use these new numbers, first of all, nobody's going to know what we're talking about because that's not the reference that they're used to. But then there's a lot of things that have to be reconfigured because we have this. So again, understanding what data is going to be collected and what, or understanding and putting in a place to map things is very important. Another example is date format, which varies by region. So I lived in London for about 5 years, and I always used to get in trouble because I'm used to doing month, day, year. So again, if we talked earlier about things like warranties and installation dates. If you're capturing that information and we're putting in the warranty information, and depending on, if you're doing a project where there's people spanning across the world and they're not entering it correctly, putting in the date in the wrong format, and then you thinking that your warranty is for date A when it's really for date B could become a really huge issue. So just some things to think about as we start to look at our data. Robert talked about structured data earlier, but even if we have structured data, how this translates over the course of a project is something that's pretty important to think about. So what's in it for us as members of the design and the construction team? We've shown why owners could want this information and what the benefits are, but why should we care? If we think about this from a design team perspective, we're provided requirements by the owner. We are then going to be constantly checking those requirements, typically against a model, to make sure that where it's designed is meeting those requirements, and if not, we can explain why. So our incentive may be to not only meet our contractual requirements, but also because we want to continue to work with that owner. So if we show that we can do a good job meeting them, they'll hire us again. From the construction team's perspective, they signed a contract with the owner to bill for a certain price, depending on what your project delivery method is. So again, they're going to be constantly checking the value of what's inside of that model as construction goes along against the price that they guaranteed. And if not, they'll be able to say, well, maybe perhaps something was added. Should I be getting more money for this? So of course, their incentive is to make sure that what they priced is what is built, comes in on budget, otherwise they're going to lose money. So, again, from the design and construction team's perspective, the easier that we can do this, the more efficient we can be when we're trying to validate these requirements, the overall easier our job would be, and we're more likely to achieve the outcomes that will make the owner happy. If we flip this from the owner's perspective, and you remember to the diagram Robert showed earlier, we can start to connect the dots. So in this example that I have here, we have a client that has a system which serves as a catalog of items that can be included in projects that they do. This is maintained by a completely separate department of people. But really what this is telling is that if I'm doing a project for this particular client, I can use these items and I know this item costs this much. So that's one system. The second system, let's imagine this as your design authoring platform of choice. So when you're using that, you're going to create a room and then you're going to add equipment to that room. So your first step is going to be, well, what item is that? And the second step is going to be how many of that particular item will go inside of the room. Then the owner is going to purchase equipment. Again, they have a separate procurement system. Now, it's important to understand the procurement system knows what's inside of that source catalog. So our first level there. It does not understand what is in your design authoring platform. So remember earlier we discussed equipment IDs, and in Robert's example, he talked about mapping. This is what this really kind of boils down to. So you'll see that we have an arrow drawn there because between the source catalog and the design authoring platform, Name of object is what is used to map. But then when we are talking about the internal mapping between us putting an item in a room and then specifying quantity, we're using something completely different. But the point is that because we have this mapping and we can choose to say, well, we'll use value A versus value B, and sometimes it's the name, sometimes it's the ID, we can connect these systems so that if we place and do things inside of our authoring system, we can still get to understand, the procurement system can understand what that means from the source catalog perspective. And that's what's really very important here. So embracing some of the concepts we discussed starts us on this path towards true digital delivery. Define outcomes that can be achieved by collecting the necessary information from the right sources. This allows us to connect different systems, ideally reusing the same information and incorporating additional detail as necessary for specific purposes. So as mentioned, let's give a real life story and scenario. So we do a lot of work for Kaiser Permanente. And as you can see from this slide, they're going to be doing a lot of building over the next few years. They had several systems to manage their standards, their equipment selection, and procurement. They decided that they wanted to improve their existing process. So they have now dRofus as a central hub to connect all these systems. So what basically happens is that medical equipment planners start projects with templates. These templates are populated with equipment. So for example, if you're doing an exam room, it might have a chair, a desk, etc. And all that equipment is based on their external equipment catalog. Each project is connected to that equipment catalog so it can receive product updates. So for example, if there's a piece of equipment and a size changes, or more importantly, let's say that there's a safety recall for a particular piece of equipment. So inside of their equipment catalog system, they'll mark it as not to be used. That will transfer through to the project. And so people will then understand, you know what, I should no longer be using this piece of equipment. I need to replace it and find a new one. In addition, because these pieces of equipment have all the information from the catalog, it means that the design team and consultants that work with Kaiser Permanente, if they select a particular piece of equipment, they have all the metadata there in terms of the sizes, the manufacturer data, etc., as well as cut sheets and images. So now they can use that as they plan their projects to understand more about the equipment. And then the final link that we have is once your project is finished being planned, dRofus is connected to their procurement system. So basically, whatever the quantities are inside of that particular project, they can be sent to the procurement system for order. In addition, information about the procurement system, so the IDs and requisite numbers are pushed back into dRofus. So if you look at a particular occurrence in dRofus, that data is there. We also further go about do some locking because, of course, after something has been ordered, you don't want somebody perhaps changing the quantity or something like that. So again, we have a mechanism to lock things so that once things are ordered, you can't change quantities. So again, I think this is a really good example of, being able to streamline their overall equipment planning process by being able to connect a bunch of systems. But again, it relies on structured data. It relies on being able to map, and it also relied on Kaiser having a plan and understanding what they wanted to achieve. So just as we begin to close up, a couple of tips and tricks so that we can hopefully successfully revolutionize what we're doing. I'm going to again put it back on us as consultants, architects, engineers, to start with the owners and really challenge them to provide specific outcomes. We also want to make sure that all the appropriate parties are part of the conversation we have. Now, I'll caution, and Robert alluded to this earlier, I want everything is not a realistic outcome. So if you look at the diagram we have here on the right, for a light fixture, it may make sense to provide an installation date for the lamp or bulb because you want to know how long it will last and perhaps when you need to replace it. But you probably don't need an ID for the bulb itself because the fixture will have an ID. If you look at the right-hand side of that diagram, you have a valve. Again, it probably makes sense to provide an ID for that because you may need to turn it on or off. But do you really need an installation date for the valve? Probably not. In the middle, we have a fan coil unit. In that case, it probably makes sense to have an ID for that so that you can locate it, as well as an installation date, because that's a piece of equipment that probably has a warranty and may go faulty. So again, owners have to be really clear about what it is that we want to do and what information we want to collect so that this doesn't feel like a data collection exercise. When you tell somebody, oh, I just want everything, that's what it starts to feel like, and then they don't see as much value as that. And then when it comes particularly to the data that you have, and we're trying to structure data and do things with data, I tell you to use tools that allow you to standardize and develop relationships. So one of the things that I will say, and you can see here on the screen, we talked earlier about room numbers. So within dRofus, we actually have a mechanism where you can assign multiple room numbers to a particular room. You'll see that highlighted in green. But what's really key for this is highlighted in red is something we call room function ID that is static. It may be hard for you guys to see, but that is actually grayed out, which means it can't be changed. So that stays consistent and allows us to develop relationships depending on what happens, because somebody may want to use the room number versus the user room number. So we have multiple fields for various purposes, but again, having that mapping allows us consistency in the back end. Next slide. The other thing too is how we enter our data. I'm a big fan of drop downs where possible, because with that, you can kind of, prescribe what it is that people should use. We tend to not use free text. The only time you really want to use free text is in situations where the entry truly can't be anticipated. But if you know, for example, that you have 6 wall finishes that everybody is being supposed to use, enter those as a drop down so people can only choose them. I don't know how many times back in the day when I was using Revit, you might go to a schedule to switch out something. So it was a type C04 wall. So I selected all instances of the C04 wall and did the change, only to realize that there were also C-04 or C.04. So when I thought I had actually changed everything, I really didn't. And then the last example I would say too is make sure that you're tailoring your approach and creating fields based on your goals. So in the example you see here for a particular project, it is very important to continue to monitor what something was at the start, which is the baseline, and then how it is as it progresses through each phase of design. So we have these fields here, and you're checking to see over the course of time, has something changed? And if there is some reason that something has changed, people can point to it, say what, when, and why. So having the ability again, and dRofus allows us to do this, to be able to create multiple fields based on your goals so that you can review and take action. So in closing, to recap, it's important to have conversations about expected outcomes, involve the right people with a good understanding of what information needs to be collected and where you can get it. And so with that, I'll turn over to Miles to do his portion for Graphisoft. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Joel. Great. Hey, everyone. I hope that you are all able to see this screen okay. Great overview there from the guys from dRofus. It's always great being on webinars or any chance to present with them. They're such a key part of our broader ecosystem here at Nemetschek. Again, it's always a pleasure. I'm going to move this out of the way. We clean it up a little bit. I'll go ahead and get this out of the way. This is a brand new slide from our legal safe harbor statement. This is just quickly saying that what I'm about to present here in this presentation is the best of my knowledge at the time. I'm sure this will exist in perpetuity for some time, and ultimately workflow standards will change. And this is simply saying that this is a frozen moment in time for all intents and purposes. I see some familiar names on the chat. I know a lot of you, a huge number of you I don't know. So just quickly, my name is Miles Smith. I'm a solutions manager over the Americas for Graphisoft. That's one of these really cool new modern and corporate terms that doesn't really tell you a lot about what I do or the value that I bring. And in short, I work very hard to stay close communication with our markets, listening for localization needs, monitoring market trends, all of these things, so I can feed back to our product direction from our headquarters here in Budapest. I'm actually sitting in our Budapest office right now. I'm over here for our product planning for the week. I've been with Graphisoft for about 5 years, but before that, I was a practicing architect for about 10. And one of the reasons that I really enjoy getting these opportunities to speak about these things is that I started my career on Revit. Later switched and moved to Archicad and was actually a BIM manager for an Archicad firm for a number of years. I went back to Revit and BIM managed for a large Revit firm, and then ultimately came to work here at Graphisoft, and have been here ever since. So one of the things that sort of put me in this position was this ability to be quote unquote bilingual from a BIM authoring standpoint. And it really put me in a great place to start leading some IFC and interoperability consulting work with our interoperability team called the CoLab. That's since been handed over to some other great folks. But again, great to be here, and we'll jump right in. For those of you who are maybe not familiar with Graphisoft, just a quick backstory. We were the first BIM authoring solution on the market. We started in 1982 here in Hungary. We now can reference millions of buildings that have been authored within the Archicad environment. Really proud of the work that we've done there. And this is just a quick overview of our offering to help sort of put this in a lens so you can have some idea of what I'm talking about if you're not familiar with our portfolio. So our flagship BIM authoring software is called Archicad. BIM Cloud is a highly secure cloud collaboration platform, BIMX for mobile coordination, and then in the European regions, DDS-CAD, and all of this is supported by Graphisoft Learn, our onboarding platform, and Graphisoft community, where you can go on and discuss this and many other topics with all the other Archicad users. Again, global presence, over 140 countries. We issue Archicad in over 26 localized versions, and again, millions of successful projects. So hopefully that tells you a bit about us and helps frame up this discussion that we're going to have. And for our approach, from kind of the Graphisoft perspective, we're going to maybe go backwards in the timeline a little bit, whereas where we differ from dRofus is specifically we are an authoring platform. So we're going to look at maybe a little earlier on the timeline, how you can set yourself up for success. We'll look at some case studies. The guys from dRofus did a great job sort of setting up the original intent of openBIM and some of the drawbacks of that, but we'll skim over that as well. And then I'm really eager kind of in the second half to give a practical approach for any of you on this call who have yet to maybe take the jump into openBIM. Maybe it feels really intimidating. So immediately just low-hanging fruit for how you can safely take that first step in the most successful and efficient way possible. So let's talk about the problem first. It's always unfortunate to start discussions like these with something like a problem statement, but in essence, we are solving a problem. When we're talking about interoperability, there's immediate perceived disconnect, and so we have an immediate sort of solvable hurdle that we can get over. So are we still considering openBIM to be an aspiration? I think based upon some of the input that we got from the guys from dRofus, I would say, yeah, it's still an aspiration. That aspiration looks first and foremost like interoperability. This ability to, in theory, work seamlessly, quote unquote, across different platforms. The promise of openBIM comes with transparency, this immediate data visibility, and then ultimate tool freedom. And these are three sort of core values that we at Graphisoft really place a lot of emphasis and core value upon, for a number of reasons. One, we have different presences in different markets. In order for us to be competitive in some markets, we simply have to work with other market dominating forces and really come to the table in a proactive way to say, hey, we know that we may not be the sort of the market controlling presence here, but we're very, very eager to come to the table and reach across the aisle, whatever we need to do to allow you to have the most effective, efficient ecosystem of consultants and role players within a project possible. In reality, there's really a partial adoption of openBIM standards. We see this exaggerated much more in some markets than others. There are all manner of inconsistent workflows. One of the challenges that we have here at Graphisoft with our client base is that when we talk about using Archicad, we talk about it in the thought that it's intuitive, it's easy to use, there's a really low barrier for adoption, and that's not necessarily the case with openBIM, IFC workflows, however you want to frame it up, and so it causes a lot of very fragmented workflows that are sometimes uninformed, and thankfully we place a lot of importance on addressing those inconsistent workflows and providing support not only for our clients but our entire sort of spectrum of stakeholders within the projects that our clients are working on. And this is what this fragmentation in practice can often look like. This is an image taken from a certain project that we did some consulting work on, where there's just this massive amount of duplicate work because of incompatible formats. And really, in our side, in the authoring standpoint, this comes down to very loose sets of agreements between cooperating or not so cooperating parties. And we tend to, some people see these data and file exchanges as sort of a message in a bottle, right? We roll up the work that we've done. We hope it's good. We put it in a glass bottle. We put it in a cork, and we throw it out into the ocean and hope that whoever gets it on the other end is the right person and that contains information that will hopefully save us from this desert island that we're on. And a lot of times we end up with deliverables much like we're seeing here on the screen. There's still this really difficult but true reality that BIM is not openBIM. Those are two very different things. BIM in and of itself, at least for the time being, is incredibly proprietary. We're seeing these proprietary silos dominate. And when there are huge market presences that can operate a closed ecosystem, it makes sense. It's typically in their best interest from a business standpoint to operate within these closed silos. We're starting to see some major changes in those realities, and we're really excited about it. But let's see how we can start to position ourselves for clarity. And what I'm saying is, in large part, sort of Graphisoft Archicad focused, because that's who I'm here on behalf of. But the great thing about talking about these things is it applies very much to other BIM authoring solutions as well. Like I said, I'm in large part bilingual. So this is an immediate payoff, not only for our Archicad clients, but for Revit clients and across the board. So what does clarity actually look like? For better, for worse, this is a big part of the problem that creates these inconsistent workflows and unfounded expectations. This is what everyone who starts out with us looking at interoperability workflows expects. A simple, easy button. I'm going to export from Archicad. It's just going to be a conversion to a Revit file, or this arrow could go back the other way, right? It could be my Revit engineer is going to export from Archicad, or sorry, from Revit back into Archicad, and that's it. In reality, this becomes a far more dynamic dance. And in reality, even this diagram that we like to show in some of our interoperability training doesn't really do the coordination and communication justice either. But what it does set up for us is a really, really clear, the possibility for a very, very clear expectation around model authorship. One of these things that we have to clear up for our clients and their consultants is the reality that if we were able to simply export a Revit file from Archicad or an Archicad file from Revit, at the very lowest hanging fruit possible, there's a very clear problem with just liability. Who owns these elements? Who's responsible for the data they're in and their upkeep and their delivery and all of these things? So we have to be able to put very, very clear guidelines around different pieces of model authoring. And with this comes really aligned expectations around data. I will admit that for many of our clients, maybe even most of our clients, the data expectations and the quality of deliverable is still in infancy. Now, I think there's a large amount of potential upside there, and I think that the table has been set in a really nice way to continue to run in that direction. But the embedded data within the modeled elements that come in and out of Archicad, in and out of Revit via an IFC exchange, are still need a lot of help in terms of coordination. I think we're making a lot of progress in terms of communicating modeling elements well and accurately, but the coordination of data still leaves a lot to be desired. And then we have to put a huge amount of emphasis on the communicative tools that surround this. We will almost always encourage our clients in these consulting agreements to go and have that ironclad as best as you can BIM execution plan. Do they end up sort of being followed to the letter of the law every single time? No, definitely not. But it is a backstop, something to refer back to every time when and if something goes awry. And so if we sort of take that diagram a step further and look at this promise from openBIM that we try to communicate to our client base in a much more real sense, this is what we actually see. It's not just about an Archicad to Revit sort of translation. It's a dynamic in and out relationship across many, many, many pieces of software and file formats, whether that be Revit or Archicad, IFC operations, BCF, workflows, SketchUp, on and on and on. And really, this promise is about everyone being able to work together in a streamlined fashion as possible. And we play a very specific role within that ecosystem, especially as a part of the broader Nemetschek Group, along with dRofus, Celebri, and a number of other softwares that we're really, really excited to work with all the time. We offer native IFC and BCF support. We do a lot of work to make sure that we remain certified for IFC import and export with the most recent standards available. We publish additional add-ons for other software to help get us in and out, even when it's not our native space. We do this with our IFC import and coordination tool for Revit that we issue all the time as a Revit add-on. We have a very happy dRofus and Archicad integration. And then all of this enables us to be very much design first and open by default. It is the background, the backbone of the way that we author the assets that we offer our client base in order for them to author in the best possible way. Through this, we're committed to enabling roles, not just formats. So this openBIM idea is not just a file format. It drastically changes the roles that are available to architects, designers, and everyone else through the design and construction process. And it puts architects in the role of data steward should they decide to be there. We emphasize that it's incredibly important that they exercise good stewardship over their data as a part of these IFC exchanges, because ultimately it helps them to lead coordination. And we know that our client base of architects and building designers are obsessed with seeing their design thought executed at an incredibly high level. And this positions them in the best possible way to ensure that that happens. Ultimately, this is also about reducing overhead through the best possible workflows. On initial adoption of these workflows, we have seen that it can feel like a massive overhead, especially when you're wading into these waters for the very first time. But ultimately, through careful education, it becomes actually a cost saving. Let's jump in now, and I have a case study that I want us to look at that I think is really interesting, and this is representative of some workflows and a series of projects that came out of a well-established interoperability office that we've continued to work with for a really long time. So some of this may, the guys from dRofus pointed to, are there case studies that we can point to that are just smash hits, super successful, everything went smoothly? Absolutely. We had two great stakeholders here that knew what they were doing coming in, were well positioned to tackle new and emerging challenges. But after this case study, we'll look at, like I said, some of those low-hanging fruit to sort of get us off the ground in the best possible way as well. So this is about a series of 3 school projects that were executed in the UK with one of our largest firms that we work with called Maber. So Maber's acting as the architect through this, and MEP and structural consultancy is coming through ARUP. Maber is doing all of their architectural scope in Archicad. ARUP is executing MEP and structural in Revit, and Tekla is also in the mix as well. And we know going in right off the bat that there's going to be a lot of this, right? There's going to be a lot of back and forth, and that's the given. These guys have worked together before. They have well-established workflows for how to do that. But now there's a new player, which is the UK government, EFA, and their BIM level 2 mandate for how this project is going to be executed. And the EFA is a governing body that provides specific standards within the UK for the way that educational projects are designed, executed, delivered, coordinated, ultimately operated. And so they had to, again, not only work in file formats and data exchanges, model exchanges that were productive for one another, but also that satisfied the requirements of the UK's EFA BIM level 2. So immediate challenges that they identified very quickly. There were still, even despite their well-established interoperability protocols, some deep-seated interoperability challenges that didn't have an immediate path forward for how they're going to resolve it. So one of these that came about really quickly was a corrupted plan grid misalignment. They identified that very quickly in their early exchanges. There was not a direct translation of the visual plan grid from the architectural scope over to the structural scope. Huge problem right off the bat. Large projects like these rely heavily on plan grids for the sake of consistency throughout. The next thing that they knew was going to be a challenge was the simple data volume that the EFA furniture and fittings catalog was going to imply. They were seeing really, really heavily bloated IFC files. And for new IFC workflows for emerging offices or emerging IFC adoptants, this is one of the biggest challenges that we see. Oh, I sent them an IFC file, and they said it took 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours to open on their end. Yeah, that's a huge problem. And the more that we have backing catalogs like this, the bigger of a problem it becomes. And then very, very specific IFC mandates around the facilities management data. They also knew that was going to be a hurdle for them to clear going forward. So the first thing that they did for their initial strategy was to augment their IFC workflow, and this means for them adopting this Revit plugin that we publish that allows for a much more direct manipulation and management of IFC translators within Revit. It's typically a specific challenge within Revit to get this to work. We're really excited to offer really strong IFC translator management within Archicad, but in order for our clients to work effectively across the aisle, the others have to do this as well. The other strategy that they had to revert back to, or let's say the solution, was that the manipulation of the plan grid was going to be a manual workflow, because they opened up this level of communication really early and said, hey, this is what we think that we can deliver and coordinate in a really streamlined way. We're going to have to make some compromises on manual workflows, and this maintenance of the plan grid was one of those. But because they had this early communication, it became almost a non-issue moving forward. The next one was a really strong model checker hub, and they're not on here with us, but they're a sister company for us and dRofus, and that's where Solibri came into the picture as well. So the idea was to unite the deliverables from Archicad, Revit MEP, and Tekla, all inside of Solibri for the sake of clash detection, and to establish a really strong expectation around the detection of those clashes, the reporting, and ultimate resolution of those clashes from the get-go. Set those expectations and use Solibri to foster all of that in a federated environment. The great thing that Solibri brought to the table that was an unexpected bonus was this more thorough, more immersive environment for client involvement. Because it was the best possible place to federate these models, it allowed the clients to see everything all together in a 3D environment, offer input rather than a simple 2D environment. And finally, the infamous BIM execution plan. They're not exciting. They're not fun. For some people, they're fun. For me, they're fun. For a lot of architects, they're not fun. They do lack a certain sex appeal, but they are wildly important as a backdrop for all of these movings, comings, and goings over the course of a project. They defined early on that it is going to be this IFC 2.3 coordinated view for everything. And then they were also able to spell out really directly naming convention mandates from a pre-design standpoint. A lot of times we start seeing this agreed upon protocol very late in a process, maybe even as late as DD or, God forbid, CD. But they were able to get in and define this from a very early standpoint. And this also allowed for a phased coordination effort where they were able to schedule some early stage rule-based checks that kept the project moving. And then they also made the interesting decision to separate BIM planning meetings early on from construction meetings. This kind of goes against traditional thought process, but at least in this case, separating those two out early allowed for these two groups of stakeholders to stay in their lane for a predefined amount of time until they were completely ready to converge again on the other end. Now, success on the back end of these saw a 90% resolution of clashes before construction started. This was something they were very proud of through this process. Like we said, it allowed for a much higher level of client engagement, client trust, client buy-in on the direction of the project. And then it also established a really valuable legacy framework for these two parties to work together going forward. A lot of times these BIM execution plans and IFC configurations, getting all of this set feels, like I said, like a massive overhead. And it may be the first time, it may be a really big overhead. But ultimately it becomes a consumable that ideally needs small tweaking and rework for future projects after the first one is successfully executed. So how do we start to take steps in the direction of this kind of success for ourselves. If it's not something that we've ever done, maybe we're feeling very, very intimidated by it. And how do we make sure it sticks? How do we make sure that it's not a one-off process that we invest a lot of time, energy, and money into, ultimately to never return to because we got burnt so badly? We have to go into it with this very early advocacy for openness from the get-go. And it takes this agreement across all party lines that this openBIM workflow is not going to be a frustration net. There may be frustration in the process, but as a net, it's a mobilizer. It's a net mobilizer below the line. And then to set this expectation for structured exports, that it's not simply an easy button, it's not just a file conversion, and this all can set up for really clear handoffs to be executed. So let's look at what some of those steps then from a BIM authoring standpoint may look like. And all of this is based upon an IFC auditing protocol that we've established here at Graphisoft. We work with our clients and their consultants to look at active projects, identify potential problems, active problems that are right there, and ideally identify early warnings for other projects down the road. And there are a couple that we're going to look at. These are by no means, this is by no means an exhaustive list of how to author responsibly from an IFC standpoint, but it's some things that you can do from, like I said, from an early point to make things as easy as possible. The first one is to make sure that you understand the purpose of your IFC export. Coming from Archicad, at least, there are two major types of geometry export that we work with. One is called a BREP, which is a boundary representation in which it is a stagnant model. It's not it's no longer manipulable, it's not parametric, but it has all of that data embedded as a part of the geometry. The other one is an extruded and revolved model in which elements maintain their parametric nature, and on the other end they can continue to be changed. And this is the exception to the rule for our clients. Typically we see these handoffs typically between, from an architect to an architect, and they have to be constrained with a really, really clear set of scope boundaries. 98% of the IFC exchanges that we see from Graphisoft customers are in this BREP scenario, where we don't necessarily want the receiving party on either side of the exchange to be able to manipulate geometry to play fast and loose with structural scope or MEP scope or architectural scope, but we want to make sure that we're delivering that information along with it. The next one has to do with elements and polygons. This is a massive contributor to some of these, 4 and 5 and 6 hour IFC imports that we see, and that's to have a really, really tight control over your LOD. We always remind our clients that at least when exporting IFC from a 3D view, truly what you see is what you get. If you're looking at a highly, highly detailed, thoroughly modeled bit of geometry, that's what's going to export. Those polygons are real. Anything you can do to manipulate level of detail on the Archicad side, on the Revit side, is going to be highly important. We want to make sure that relationship of our building, our built environment, is consistent in its relationship to project origin or survey point in Archicad. These names get changed across the way to project base point, survey point. Ideally, we place the corner of the building on these points, something that is easily referenced should some coordination issue between parties come up. The next thing is vertical controls. When we're setting up our stories in our architectural model, in our structural model, in our MEP model, this is one of the first conversations that we really have to have, is say, okay, we want to make sure that reference levels across stakeholders are named the same and have the same vertical intervals. This is one of the most common things that we see, where geometry on one side is floating at a very different location geometry on the other side or in the other software. MEP and mechanical engineers especially like to have a lot of extra reference levels. Architects frequently, they do sometimes, structural not as much. So we need to have those early coordination meetings to make sure that we can identify those vertical control needs from the beginning. Having a really clear understanding of this classification, this is something that hits our Archicad users maybe a little more than others. In Archicad, we don't have as many defined tools because we like to let our users say, hey, if I want to model a chair using this lab tool, we want to give them that freedom, but we want to make sure that the DNA of that object sort of carries through. Yes, it is a chair using this lab tool. Let's make sure that it gets the classification that it needs to translate through accordingly. We do a lot of these audits. This is a graphic override combination that we give to some of our clients so they can quickly see, are there things that don't have classification at all? And this is 410 elements in a project that have no classification, and they're just exporting as a IFC building element proxy, or what I like to call digital Play-Doh. This is one of the next really big ones, and it's one that people shy away from at first, but I always encourage people to have a number, a high number, maybe not a high number, but a reasonable number of IFC views. In almost all cases, a single IFC view is a recipe for disaster. So this is all from a sample project that we use called the S Office. And these are, three potentials for six potentials for different IFC views, such that you could separate out structure from mechanical, from structural core, rooms, quote unquote, such that after you send these IFC files out to your consultant, let's say that there's a problem with one. They can quickly load the other five, continue to remain mobile while you address the issue in that one, rather than putting a complete stop on everything because it's all in one file. I know I've been going, I think I'm almost at time here, but some final thoughts, and I think this aligns really well with what the guys from dRofus were saying. Ultimately, chaos is opacity. Even if you're working in a quote unquote open BIM capacity, if all of these things, modeled elements and the data line there within, are not well structured, well coordinated, even in the most open format, this chaos creates opacity, and this clarity comes from organizing, communicating in a very open way, and ultimately that open BIM is achievable with the right mindset. It just takes a little shift. And finally, I love having these kinds of conversations. Please do reach out. Please ask some questions, and I'm going to kick it back to Janice now.